If you want women to respect you, you have to develop these three qualities that make relationships feel effortless. Now, most gurus will tell you to keep building your finances, status, and looks, but they ignore the deep underlying problem that none of those things actually make a woman respect you in the long term. So, in this video, I'm going to break down where disrespect starts, why it happens, and the three legs to fix it so you can have great relationships that actually last. All right, so if you're anything like me, you were probably brought up thinking that respect in relationships is something that is implied in commitment when two people get together, and that disrespect is something that happens accidentally or unintentionally. But over the years, after analyzing hundreds of relationships and spending hours studying the psychology behind all of this, I've realized that things are not quite as they seem. You see, disrespect in relationships rarely makes itself known. It doesn't come as a blowout or an insult you can directly point to. On the contrary, the devil is in the details. It often starts with a dismissive comment or a rolled eye or even a joke at your expense that lands a little sideways. It's small things of that nature that are easy to brush off, and that's exactly the point of it. You see, for a moment, just think about what happens when you put a frog in the water and start to slowly raise the temperature. Each degree is too small to even register as a threat, so the frog's nervous system never receives a strong enough signal to trigger an escape. And by the time the water is dangerous to the frog, he's already gotten used to it. And this is exactly what happens in relationships. You see, consciously or not, each act of disrespect is calibrated just below the limit that triggers a reaction. A rolling of the eyes is not a conflict. An offhanded comment isn't an insult. A joke at your expense isn't abuse. So every action has enough deniability to make a reaction feel out of proportion. And that's why you and most men would have nothing to say about that. But the temperature continues to slowly rise and rise and rise. And what you don't see happening beneath the surface is an operant conditioning loop where every time disrespect goes unchecked, it gets reinforced. But here's what makes it difficult to break: the reinforcement is inconsistent. Sometimes you react and sometimes you don't. And predictable reinforcement is the most stubborn behavioral pattern to kill. This is the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. So the woman isn't consciously strategizing, it's her nervous system simply learning what works on the schedule that makes learning most long lasting. But what does this mean in practice? Well, by the time there is an undeniable proof of disrespect, the pattern has already been running for months. You can't just trace it back to one moment because it's not one moment, it's a pattern of tolerance, compounding over time until it reaches a certain limit. And when that threshold finally breaks, whether through betrayal or cheating, it feels sudden, almost like a switch went off. But the truth is, the water has been rising the entire time. So you have to understand this. The moment a woman's behavior feels off deep down in your gut, that is the moment to address it. And you address it with a calm response that sets the standard and the terms, because one response delivered early recalibrates the dynamic before the pattern is further ingrained in your relationship. So, why does this even matter? At a deeper level, well, relationships all settle into a unique balance over time, into patterns where neither person has a strong reason to change, because the cost of emotional pain and chaos feels higher than the cost of continuing. So, if the balance was set with you sucking up emotional abuse, for example, the relationship will strengthen that pattern over time. And trying to disrupt that pattern later in the relationship isn't a matter of asserting your boundaries any longer, because it triggers what is called an extinction burst. When you finally begin enforcing a boundary after months or years of compliance, disrespect actually spikes before it starts to die down. But what usually happens is most men interpret the spike as proof that standing up for themselves just isn't working because of the drama, the fighting, and the emotional turmoil. So they cut their losses, call it a day, and collapse back into their old selves, which ultimately locks the negative cycle permanently. But why are most men caught in this cycle in the first place? Well, the answer isn't simply a lack of character. It's also a structural problem. Three specific weak points that make disrespect the most likely outcome long before you go on a first date. You see, most men approach the problem of disrespect as if it's a single failure, but chronic disrespect in dating and relationships always arises from three weak points operating simultaneously, each one enabling the next. Think of a three legged stool. If you remove one leg, the stool becomes unstable. Sure, may be manageable under certain conditions, but it tips over under some real pressure. Remove two legs and it cannot stand regardless of how strong the remaining leg is. You see, most self development advice is like single leg thinking. They'll tell you, just have options, bro, and have higher standards and learn to communicate, as if any one of these in isolation will solve the underlying problem. A man with options and no standards chooses poorly and creates unhealthy dynamics, regardless of his abundance. A man with standards and no social skill may attract women intellectually, but fails to maintain desire, which erodes the respect his standards were meant to produce. And thirdly, a man with social skills and no options uses his skills through a scarcity mentality, which means everything he does is in service of keeping what he has rather than taking what he wants. The stool only stands properly when all three legs are firm and they have to be built in the right order. And the first leg is optionality. For the majority of men, sex is a scarce resource, and regardless of how it shows up in every man's life, it always distorts a man's judgment to a very large extent. When you operate from a mindset that losing the relationship means returning to nothingness, every decision you make is driven by that anxiety. You hold standards until holding them feels expensive. You enforce a boundary until her reaction makes the cost way too high. You know what you should do, but you do the opposite because scarcity makes self destruction feel rational, as crazy as that sounds. You see, the biology behind this is quite simple. Women are choosers because they invest more in reproduction via pregnancy, childbirth, and raising children. So they hold the power of choice. Men, on the other hand, compete to be chosen. And this imbalance means that unless a man has built real value like a strong presence, social status, financial stability, and genuine attractiveness, he's starting from a weaker position in any interaction. A man with no perceived options can't be taken as seriously because there's no visible threat of him being able to walk away, which means his standards carry no weight because she quickly makes out that the cost of enforcing them is higher than the cost of tolerating her behavior. A boundary is never just a boundary, it's also a signal of your position. And his true position is this: I need this more than I'm willing to show. So if you lose the ability and the deep conviction within yourself that you will undoubtedly walk away from women who fall out of line or even worse hurt you, they will not take you that seriously, no matter how much they say that they love you and care for you. And this takes me to the second leg, which is personal standards. When you can't attract what you want, you settle for what's available. And poor selection, choosing a woman whose baseline interest in you is very low or whose perception of your value is already below hers, means that you're fighting for respect before the relationship has even started. A woman who enthusiastically chose you and saw the highest value in you will bring a level of respect that requires almost no effort to maintain. But a woman who feels like she's settled or you settle for brings a level of respect that requires constant management. And constantly managing her respect is exhausting and ultimately unsuccessful. In psychology, this is what researchers call self verification theory. Men with low self worth unconsciously choose partners whose behavior validates their internal storyline because relationships that contradict their self image produce inner conflict, and the tension that usually creates is more uncomfortable than the disrespect itself. So, female selection isn't just a matter of skill, it's an identity problem as well. And identity problems don't resolve themselves from just technical changes like hiding your feelings or being more open. The third leg is social intelligence. The most underrated and misapplied qualities in dating and relationships is not pickup artistry or game or any of that. It's social intelligence. It's the ability to manufacture and maintain genuine desire such that she wants to respect you rather than be required to. You see, women read a man's internal self respect through micro expressions, body language, behavioral patterns, before a word is even spoken. Research on mirror neurons and emotional contagion shows that emotional states actually transfer between people almost automatically. If a man doesn't feel psychologically secure, she detects it neurologically. She responds to what his nervous system broadcasts, not what he says about himself. And no amount of tactical confidence can override a nervous system that doesn't believe in its own performance. You see, this is the most important insight in this entire video. The psychological triggers that create attraction and desire on the first date are the same ones required on the 15th and 100th date: presence, unpredictability, certainty, decisiveness, the sense that this man has a life and direction that doesn't hinge on her behavior. These don't become optional when commitment starts. They become more important because commitment raises the stakes without removing the requirement. So, what you have to do now is identify which leg of that stool is the shortest, not the one you want to work on. For most men, that's going to be optionality because scarcity is the root cause from which both other deficits usually grow. If your options are genuinely limited, your priority is clear. You have to build alternatives, and it starts with your mindset. You have to experience the feeling of dating and exploring multiple options so you get an understanding of how women operate, what you actually like and dislike before refining anything else. Because trying to have standards or build social intelligence with the wrong mindset becomes deceptive or misleading, and it can never lead to a genuine connection. When these three weaknesses combine, even a great woman starts to feel drained because she's not getting what she finds safety in from a man long term. This doesn't happen consciously, but constant stress affects how she thinks and makes decisions. Inconsistent affection, for example, keeps her emotionally hooked, and over time, she stops believing anything will change. And that's usually when a man loses all self control in the relationship. But even when men develop all these qualities, there's still one final mistake. They treat commitment as the finish line, as the point where the effort that built the attraction can finally be taken for granted. And that mistake, more than any single act of weakness, is what costs everything they've built. That brings me to my last point, which is the game doesn't end when she's yours. You see, that's a mistake almost every man makes the moment a woman commits to him. He comes to a stoplight because commitment registers somewhere in his nervous system as the finish line, the point in which the version of himself that attracted her can finally settle down. So he becomes more available and predictable. He becomes less the man she was attracted to and more the kind of man who maintains the relationship. Slowly but surely, without a single dramatic event, the feelings that made her fall in love with him begin to die away. Think about what happens to athletes after winning a championship. The ones who treat it as the destination, the end point of the hunger that got them there, almost universally declines over the following season. They lose their edge, not their talent, but the external pressure that elevated their performance is replaced by the comfort of achievement. The ones who keep playing at a high level understand that winning changes the stakes, but not the requirement, because the game ultimately has to continue. The standard that won the championship is now the minimum required to actually defend it. Attraction in long term relationships runs on identical logic. The same things that created desire are the same things required to sustain it. It's a way of being. The moment commitment becomes the reason to relax rather than the context in which to grow, she's no longer relating to the man she chose. She's relating to a version of him that commitment produced, and that version is far less attractive. And here's what many don't understand about the practical failure that creates this end result. The problem almost always traces back to the beginning and to the absence of defined terms, namely, no clarity on what he will and won't tolerate, no explicit frame established early enough to shape the dynamic before it settles. And months into the relationship, when she's acting in ways he finds unacceptable, he's totally blindsided. But the real failure was actually upstream because he's ignored all the warning signs. He jumped over the whole vetting process and he dove headfirst into commitment before she even earned it. Then he relaxed into that commitment as if the work that preceded it was the actual work rather than the foundation for the work that continues indefinitely. And in game theory, whoever sets the terms of an interaction early holds all of the power. Failing to define the terms at the outset is surrendering first mover advantage in the relationship's contract. So, the most optimal relationship strategy is what is called tit for tat. You start by being cooperative. You immediately signal when a line has been crossed, and you invest in proportion to how much he is investing in the relationship. Men who never signal when a line is crossed are playing a losing game because it's the most exploitable strategy in relationships. And the woman doesn't even need to be smart to take advantage of it. She just needs to keep playing. So here's what you need to do: identify three things you are doing in the early stages that attracted her. And I don't mean tactics, I mean expressions of who you were when you were operating at full capacity, the standards you held, the ambition, the direction, the life that existed independent of her. Then slowly bring those things back into frame. This is not a strategy to seduce her all over again. It's simply to return to the version of yourself that made this possible in the first place. Here's the reason this is the most important point in this video. Everything else, from setting the right baseline, building the three structural foundations, this all assumes you remain the man who established those things. But the most common failure in long term relationships isn't a single act of weakness, it's the slow accumulation of small relaxations that together produce a fundamentally different man than the one she ultimately chose. She fell for a person operating at full capacity, not for a role. The work isn't to perform that person indefinitely. It's to build a life substantial enough that operating at full capacity is your natural state, not the effort you make to keep her, but the way you move through the world, regardless of whether she's watching or not. That's the man disrespect doesn't reach. Now, if you want to take this a step further and you don't want to go through the guesswork alone, you can book a free strategy call with me where we break down what patterns are keeping you stuck, what needs to change, and get full clarity on your situation. If this sounds like you, then you can click the first link in my bio and book a strategy call. And with that said, my friends, I'm going to close off this episode here. As always, let me know what you think. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. And thank you for listening. And I'll see you in the next one. Take care.